If you have a Bible with you, I invite you to open it to Numbers chapter 16. Numbers chapter 16. Again, I apologize for the lengthy scripture reading. Again, what I wanted to do was just get the main verses from the text that I want to focus most of all on throughout the lesson, throughout the study. I just wanted to make sure that we got those as I was giving those verses out. And I really do. This is a story in the Old Testament that has been one of my favorites. I mean, maybe it's just for every young boy, but it's an interesting story. I mean, you have judgment, and in a very extraordinary way, I mean, the earth opens up and swallows those who are the enemies of God, and you have all of this just interesting things happening just within this story. And so it's always been intriguing to me. The older I get, though, and the more that I've studied, the more that I learn about the gospel, just the more intriguing it gets, because I do think, as is the topic of our series, I think you see, especially in a story like this, glimpses of Jesus, glimpses of the gospel. We're going to go to Jude 11. We referenced that already on Sunday, but we're going to come back to that because it references three different Old Testament stories with Cain and with Balaam and with Korah's rebellion. I almost decided to just go through each of those stories after Sunday's lessons. I decided to go a different route, but I wanted to at least come to this one because I do think that this is a very interesting, as I said, but a very powerful story, and especially with some of the connections I hope to make as we go throughout. But I will just start, as usual, just by extending my thanks to you all for inviting me here, the brethren at Jamestown. I've really enjoyed my time here, not just because it's back home, essentially, so close to mine and Paige's hometown. Although that is a big bonus. I'm not going to lie, it has been a real treat for me to be able to be a part of this meeting this week, because I got to have a big portion of my family out on Sunday night, and that was really nice. It had been a long time since I got to hear my uncle, my aunt, another aunt, my grandma, my dad, all of us singing together. First time in a long time, and so that was really a beautiful thing. It also is just nice because I get to see so many people that I have met in the past but haven't been able to see in a long time. Just tonight, I saw someone from I don't know if you know this congregation, but from Lafayette Heights, which was the first congregation I remember being in a worship service. And so I told them, before you leave tonight, you must meet my wife. So it's just good to be able to see old faces, to be able to see people that you never lose a relationship with because of this bond that we have through Jesus. And Jesus is what I want to focus on tonight, obviously, as we look at this notion of looking for glimpses of Jesus. Tonight, we just look at another story that the New Testament harkens back to, not only, I think, because it is you see a shadow of Christ, but also for very important instruction for the church, as we'll look at in a moment in Jude 11. But before we get into any of the main points tonight, what I want to start with is by looking at, as we go through Numbers 16, just looking at how the people of Israel, all throughout the story, it's kind of a lengthy chapter, but all throughout the chapter, they react towards God's chosen priest, how they react towards Aaron, and how they react towards even Moses, who's not a priest, but he is a chosen, appointed leader of Israel. But all throughout, not only how you see certain individuals like Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, but especially the rest of the congregation of Israel, and see how seriously God takes that. So that way, maybe we can get some of the lesson that I think today his people are supposed to learn still. And so as we get into the lesson tonight, I just want to start with just a general breakdown of what you see as we get into Numbers 16. So beginning in verse 1 of Numbers chapter 16, it says, "Now Korah, the son of Izhar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, with Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and On, the son of Peleth, sons of Reuben, took action. And they rose up before Moses, together with some of the sons of Israel, 250 leaders of the congregation, chosen in the assembly, men of renown. They assembled together against Moses and Aaron and said to them, 'You have gone far enough, for all the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is in their midst. So why do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord?' When Moses heard this, he fell on his face, and he spoke to Korah and all his company, saying, 'Tomorrow morning the Lord will show who is his, and who is holy, and will bring him near to himself. Even the one whom he will choose, he will bring near to himself. Do this. Take censers for yourselves, Korah, and all your company, and put fire in them, and lay incense upon them in the presence of the Lord tomorrow. And the man whom the Lord chooses shall be the one who is holy. You have gone far enough, you sons of Levi. Then Moses said to Korah, hear now, you sons of Levi, is it not enough for you that the God of Israel has separated you from the rest of the congregation of Israel to bring you near to himself, to do the service of the tabernacle of the Lord, and to stand before the congregation to minister to them? And that he has brought you near, Korah, and all your brothers, sons of Levi, with you. And are you seeking for the priesthood also? Therefore, you and all your company are gathered together against the Lord. But as for Aaron, who is he that you grumble against him? Then Moses sent a summons to Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, but they said, we will not come up. Is it not enough that you have brought us up out of a land flowing with milk and honey to have us die in the wilderness? But would you also lord it over us? Indeed, you have not brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey, nor have you given us an inheritance of fields and vineyards. Would you put out the eyes of these men? We will not come up. Then Moses became very angry and said to the Lord, do not regard their offering. I have not taken a single donkey from them, nor have I done harm to any of them. Moses said to Korah, you and all your company be present before the Lord tomorrow, both you and they along with Aaron. Each of you take his fire pan and put incense on it, and each of you bring his censer before the Lord, 250 fire pans. Also, you and Aaron shall each bring his fire pan. So they each took his own censer and put fire on it, and laid incense on it, and they stood at the doorway of the tent of meeting with Moses and Aaron. Thus Korah assembled all the congregation against them at the doorway of the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all the congregation. Now, just stop there for just a moment. What's going on here? Well, you have certain individuals, Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Those are the men who are named specifically. And what they are doing essentially is these are Levites. And as you know, all priests are Levites, but there's even more specifics given. To be a priest, you had to be a son of Aaron. So what you have is a group of Levites who are not necessarily happy with the inheritance that they've been given thus far. And so they're trying to do things, as you see them taking the censers and the fire pans, and as Moses seems to indicate, they're trying to take upon themselves a role that God has not given them. And they're trying to do the things that only the priesthood was allowed to do, that only the priesthood was consecrated to do, was sanctified to do. And so, as you see on the screen, a test is given to see who God is going to choose, who God is going to bring near to himself. And essentially, a test is given to see whatever God decides, whatever his answer is, that is the one who is truly his priest. So just as we look at that, I want to make sure we get the context of number 16. So continuing on in verse 20, after it says the glory of the Lord appeared to all the congregation to give an answer, in verse 20, the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, separate yourselves from among this congregation, that I may consume them instantly. But they fell on their faces and said, O God, God of the spirits of all flesh, when one man sins, will you be angry with the entire congregation? Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the congregation, saying, get back from around the dwellings of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Then Moses arose and went to Dathan and Abiram with the elders of Israel following him. And he spoke to the congregation, saying, depart now from the tents of these wicked men, and touch nothing that belongs to them, or you will be swept away in all their sin. So they got back from around the dwellings of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. And Dathan and Abiram came out and stood at the doorway of their tents, along with their wives and their sons and their little ones. Moses said, by this you shall know that the Lord has sent me to do all these deeds. For this is not my doing. If these men die the death of all men, or if they suffer the fate of all men, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord brings about an entirely new thing, and the ground opens its mouth and swallows them up with all that is theirs, then they descend alive into Sheol, and you will understand that these men have spurned the Lord. And so, not only has a test been given specifically to the Levites, but now there's another test that is introduced, but specifically to the people. As God's, and we'll talk about this more in a moment, but it says the congregation of Israel seemed to be with Korah, Dathan, and Abiram at the start. And as God said that he was about to bring his judgment, Moses and Aaron intercede for the people, for the rest of the congregation of Israel. And God, being a merciful and gracious God he is, he allows them to go and warn them to come back. They get away. They separate themselves. They do just as the Lord has commanded. They do as Moses tells them to do, as God instructed him to. And he even gives them more signs, another test that they can see as proof That this is not just something that Moses is doing. This is not just something that Moses and Aaron just happen to be able to orchestrate themselves. No, this is going to be something that there's absolutely no question that can be had. Now just remember that thought, that this is something that if it occurs, there are undoubtedly, this is the work of God, or the judgment of God. Well, you continue on in verse 31. It says, as he finished speaking all these words, the ground that was under them split open, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up, and their households, and all the men who belonged to Korah with their possessions. So they and all that belonged to them went down alive to Sheol, and the earth closed over them, and they perished from the midst of the assembly. All Israel who were around them fled at their outcry, for they said, the earth may swallow us up. Fire also came forth from the Lord and consumed the 250 men who were offering the incense. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, say to Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, that he shall take up the censers out of the midst of the blaze, for they are holy, and you scatter the burning coals abroad. As for the censers of these men who have sinned at the cost of their lives, let them be made into hammered sheets for a plating of the altar, since they did present them before the Lord, and they are holy. And they shall be for a sign to the sons of Israel. So Eleazar the priest took the bronze censers which the men who were burned had offered, and they hammered them out as a plating for the altar, as a reminder to the sons of Israel that no layman who is not of the descendants of Aaron should come near to burn incense before the Lord, so that he will not become like Korah and his company, just as the Lord had spoken to him through Moses. And so here, a couple of tests have been given. There are signs that have been undoubtedly proven by God. This is not just something that Moses and Aaron were able to come up with and pull off themselves. No man could do this. This was an answer from God that the people got to see themselves. So with that in mind, now we get to the conclusion of Numbers chapter 16, and you would think that after all of these things, it would say, and the Israelites never did anything to aggravate the Lord ever again. Mind you, this is after a lot of other things that they have seen, the 10 plagues, for example, the very deliverance from Egypt that God provided for them. But after all of these things, after even this, what does it say in the next verse? In verse 41. But on the next day, all the congregation of the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron, saying, you are the ones who have caused the death of the Lord's people. It came about, however, when the congregation had assembled against Moses and Aaron, that they turned toward the tent of meeting, and behold, the cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord appeared. Then Moses and Aaron came to the front of the tent of meeting, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, get away from among this congregation, that I may consume them instantly. Then they fell on their faces. Moses said to Aaron, take your censer and put it in fire from the altar, and lay incense on it. Then bring it quickly to the congregation to make atonement for them, for wrath has gone forth from the Lord. The plague has begun. Then Aaron took it as Moses had spoken, and ran into the midst of the assembly. For behold, the plague had begun among the people. So he put on the incense and made atonement for the people. He took his stand between the dead and the living, so that the plague was checked. But those who died by the plague were 14,700, besides those who died on account of Korah. Then Aaron returned to Moses at the doorway of the tent of meeting, for the plague had been checked. And you could even go into chapter 17, because I think the story just continues on into that chapter. And you see even more indication given by the Lord specifically to show who his chosen priest really is. Now, all of that, just to say, I wanted to get the context of the story before we started making some of the points we're going to tonight. But you look at all of this, it's pretty clear from the outset what we could say about just authority alone. But really, I want to look at how they rebelled against that authority. How is it that they rebelled against God? Not just Korah, but all of the congregation of Israel. And all of it, I think, culminates in the idea of rejection. They rejected so many different things, so many different instructions, and ultimately, I would say God. First of all, they rejected God's appointed leaders. In verses 3 and 11, at the very end of the verse, you see this notion that when they are coming to grumble against and complain about Moses and Aaron and all these things that they're saying about Aaron, I love how even Dathan and Abiram speak to Moses saying, well, we could have been in the promised land already, but we weren't able to come because you didn't lead us there. Completely overwriting history, completely revising everything that occurred when you have all of these leaders that clearly wanted to lead the people of Israel into the promised land. No, it wasn't them. It was the assembly. It was the people that didn't trust in God. The people who did not believe and have enough faith. But what is interesting about this, as they reject God's appointed leaders, what you find time and time again is that ultimately this is a rejection of God himself. Because who is the one that put them in those positions? Who is the one that put them in those roles? And I think you see this even with the priesthood itself, and we'll get into more detail on that as we go. But even within the priesthood itself, what were these men doing? They weren't satisfied with what they had. They weren't satisfied with the position that God had already given them, a very beautiful position that God had already given them. As Levites, their inheritance was the Lord. How beautiful a statement is that? But yeah, you can even take that for granted. And so they tried to take the roles of the priesthood upon themselves. And the rest of Israel just goes, I think they go just as far as Korah, Dathan, and Abiram in this. Down in verses 41 and 42, you see in their statements, as just the next day, they immediately turn around and say, you're the ones that have caused the death of the Lord's people. Really? Wow. What power that Moses and Aaron must have had to do that. No, clearly, it was God. And what was he proving? But that my enemies will receive judgment. And unfortunately, they didn't get that quick enough. And in the process, they made themselves enemies of God. And I definitely think that there's some application for us to take from that today. But not only did they reject God's appointed leaders, they rejected God's specifically appointed method of worship. Again, as you look at their service of the tabernacle, in verse 15, Moses speaks of this. It says he became very angry. And he said to the Lord, do not regard their offering. I have not taken a single donkey from them, nor have I done harm to any of them, as they make accusations against Moses. Moses said to Korah, you and all your company be present before the Lord tomorrow, both you and they along with Aaron. Each of you take his fire pan and put incense on it. You want to try and be like the priests? Okay, well, why don't you try and why don't you go ahead and you do what the priests are supposed to do, and we'll see what happens. And we just read the story and we know what happens. But he talks about how they truly did have this beautiful blessing of having that inheritance, being the Lord specifically. I think that they just forgot that. In Joshua 13 and verse 33, it says this. It just says this notion. The tribe of Levi, Moses did not give an inheritance. The Lord, the God of Israel, that is their inheritance, as he had promised to them. Over in Numbers 18, in verse 32 beginning, it says, these are the territories which Moses apportioned for an inheritance in the plains of Moab, beyond the Jordan at Jericho, to the east. While they were, after they had, during the invasion and conquest of the promised land, they were finally divvying out these portions of the land. And in verse 33, but to the tribe of Levi, Moses did not give an inheritance. The Lord, the God of Israel, is their inheritance, as he had promised to them. Do you think that they would have suffered much because they didn't get the same kind of inheritance that the rest of Israel got? I really do wonder how the rest of the tribes of Israel would have thought about these verses when God says that their inheritance is the Lord and the work of the tabernacle. And I wonder if maybe some of the other tribes looked at that and thought, oh, if only. Unfortunately, I think what you see throughout Israel's history is that they didn't even think that way of the priests in the long run. I mean, Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, surely they are doing this here. But in the long run, it doesn't seem like anyone wants to try and be that kind of holy. It doesn't seem like anyone wants to be consecrated to that degree. Rather, they just want to wait and sit around until the next day so that they can continue in their evil. But so here's a few different ways that they rejected God. They rejected his appointed leaders. They rejected his specifically appointed method of worship. And again, I think this culminates, I think this rejection is ultimately defined as a rejection of God himself. In verse 11, Moses says specifically, of number 16, therefore you and all your company are gathered together against the Lord. But as for Aaron, who is he, that you grumble against him? And so when you come against God's just commandments, when you come against God's word, no matter what, no matter who you are acting like is the face of your opposition, God is truly the face of your opposition. And you don't get to sit back and say, no, it's not God that I'm going against. You don't get to say that. You've already shown your hand. You're an enemy of God. And that is what Korah, Dathan, and Abiram absolutely were. And God reveals how seriously offensive this is to him. Twice he says the exact same thing in verse 21 and 45. As he's about to bring judgment in the first instance, he says, separate yourselves from them and I will destroy them instantly. And they intercede for the people, and then the people separate themselves. But even the next day after they go forward, he says the exact same thing. And even then they have to intercede for the people. And the plague even begins immediately. And I think this time it begins immediately because it's supposed to show us how serious the offense was. They have so egregiously gone against the Lord. They have completely let go of the words that he has spoken, the promise that he has given them, the signs that he has given them, the ample amount of signs and evidence. And ultimately, they have rejected it simply by just letting it go, by overlooking it in the long run. And so I think these are a few ways that they rejected God. And I think that these are ways that we can reject God even today. And I just want to make sure we understand the notion that no matter what, it always, from the Old Testament times to the New Covenant, this always brings dire, grave consequences, ultimately death, whether it be physical or spiritual. Well, how does God answer to the rebellion? How does God answer the test? There is a test given, as we already saw in verse 5 of Numbers chapter 16. In verse 5 it says, tomorrow morning the Lord will show who is his and who is holy and who will bring him near to himself. Even the one whom he will choose, he will bring near to himself. That's the test that Moses gives. Now, how does God answer? And I think that this is the most interesting part of Numbers chapter 16, how powerfully God answers. Well, in each case, whether it be from Korah, Dathan, and Abiram and the 250 men with them, or the rest of the congregation of Israel, in each case, he answers with the very one that they rejected. And you even kind of see this in the New Testament when Stephen is preaching in Acts chapter 7 about Moses' life, a little bit of Moses' life, and how and you go through that, and you go through the patriarchs, and you go through all of this list of Israel's history. And one of the main points I think Stephen makes is, you have always rejected the one that God has sent you. You have a long history of the one that God has chosen to lead you and deliver you of utterly rejecting him and utterly despising him. And surely they did that with God's leaders in Numbers 16 with Moses and Aaron. But specifically with Aaron, God uses him, I think, solely, especially, emphatically in this chapter. Well, not only that, not only does he use the one who was rejected by all of the people, really, but he also answers with the one who stands alive before him offering the appropriate worship. He doesn't respect the worship of those who are doing so inappropriately or taking a role that is not supposed to be theirs. In verse 31 of Numbers 16, verse 31, it says, as he finished speaking all these words, the ground that was under them split open, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up, and their households and all the men who belonged to Korah with their possessions. So they and all that belonged to them went down alive to Sheol, and the earth closed over them, and they perished from the midst of the assembly. All Israel who were around them fled at their outcry, for they said, the earth may swallow us up. Fire also came forth from the Lord and consumed the 250 men who were offering the incense. So not only are the men specifically named, Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, not only are they swallowed up, but all of the other men who tried to take the priestly role upon themselves, which was not theirs, God makes short work of them too. Quick, swift work of them. And he wants to make sure that all of the people, just like in Leviticus chapter 10, all of the people that do not approach me as holy, treat me as holy, I will be treated as holy, and they will be condemned, and I will bring swift judgment to them. You just see that consistent lesson all the way throughout the Bible. And I don't know how many times God has to say it before it actually gets through, to people's heads, to his people. Well, not only that, but he answers with the one who ultimately makes atonement for all of the people. In verse 41 through 48, what you find is Aaron, not Moses, incidentally, simply Aaron, God's high priest. He is the one who, and you can imagine the scenery, him being the one that stands in between the dead and the living. Can you imagine being the person next to Aaron when the plague almost got to you and seeing everyone on the other side of it dead? Can you imagine the fear that would strike? Just the utter awe of the scenery. Did God not answer with Aaron? Pretty emphatically there. And I think especially at least for the people that were right next to Aaron and the plague almost got to them, I can't imagine that this wouldn't have just gotten through. And yet you see this stubbornness all the way throughout the Old Testament and through the rest of their history. Not only that, but in each case, the rejected one makes intercession for the people attacking them. Moses and Aaron, each time when they are accused, I love how each time they are accused, they pray to the Lord. They go to him first. They bow their head humbly to the Lord, and they pray to him. But specifically, when it comes to the judgment that's about to come, and the judgment that does come at the end of the chapter, what you find when God says he's going to bring the judgment, instantly he's going to consume them all. Moses and Aaron both are interceding for the people. And I can just imagine how easy it would have been to say, you know what, they deserve it. You know how many times they have complained? Do you know how many times that they have grumbled against these men specifically, and after they have only done what the Lord has commanded them to do? And we're not even at Numbers 20 yet, where Moses goes too far and does sin because probably out of a little bit of anger because of all of this. You'd think they'd learn at this point. But everything, water from the rock, manna from heaven, all of that, and yet you still have people grumbling and complaining. I don't do well hearing people complain just at the grocery store. You know, I don't know why. I guess it's just a pet peeve. But someone can walk in. You know those people. As soon as you talk to them, start a conversation. Well, how are you doing today? Well, it could be better. And let me just tell you about this whole last week. And there's nothing but negativity for every single day. And then by the end of the conversation, you think, well, I might as well know your name at this point because you've given me the whole itinerary of your week. And nothing but negative, nothing but grumbling and complaining. That's annoying enough when it comes from people that we don't even know. But when it comes from people that should be the closest to us, I can imagine that'd be a lot harder. And yet, Moses and Aaron, I think, are good examples of people who suffer long for their brethren. And I think it's because of that intercession that God is more merciful, more gracious than he has to be. Well, all of this just to say, just as like we did yesterday, I want to make a few connections. Again, I think you see a strong shadow of Jesus in all of these things. Where do I think we see these? Well, first of all, with the notion that the one that is rejected by the people, that is the one God chooses. We already talked about what Stephen did in Acts chapter 7, how Israel has always rejected the one that was supposed to deliver them. And then he gets to the main point. You've rejected the one. You've rejected Jesus. And over in Isaiah 53 and verse 3, this was prophesied about. He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and like one from whom men hide their face. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. John 1 and verse 11. He came to his own, and his own did not receive him. His own were the ones that put him to death. His own, his brethren, were the ones that led the charge. And so here I think you see a pretty tight connection of the shadow of Jesus, where this comes into where it culminates in Jesus. Not only that, but God clearly speaks of who his chosen one is. We read Matthew chapter 3 and verse 17 yesterday, but this is spoken of in Hebrews 5, beginning in verse 5. So also Christ did not glorify himself so as to become a high priest, but he who said to him, the Father, you are my son, today I have begotten you. Just as he says also in another passage, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Over in Hebrews chapter 9 in verse 11. Hebrews 9 and verse 11. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things to come, he entered through the greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is to say, not of this creation, and not through the blood of goats and calves, but through his own blood he entered the holy place once for all, having obtained eternal redemption. And so it is this one who God has, the Father has chosen as the high priest, who is going to who is going to be the one to actually deliver his people, deliver those who want to be a part of this kingdom. You know, and we can look at other passages that talk about Jesus being that high priest, being this chosen one that the Father specifically has picked out, that the Father specifically has appointed. But it's not even just the Jews that I think that could have understood this. You even see in Luke's account, in Luke 23, you even see a centurion, you even see a Gentile come to the conclusion, surely this is the Son of God. And so it's not just religious people that came to this conclusion. It is even Gentiles that could tell at different times. And so God clearly speaks from the life of Christ all the way up to his crucifixion, and specifically through his beating of death in his resurrection. Not only that, but God's judgment is coming, just like it was on the congregation of Israel. And God's wrath, like we talked about in Romans chapter 3 and verses 25 through 26, it needs to be appeased, and it is coming for all those who have sinned against him. And who is that? But everyone. Every single person that has lived, every single person that has made a decision to break God's law and chosen to go against him. And so that wrath is coming. And who is the one who stands between the living and the dead? You have Jesus, just like Aaron, standing in the breach for all of humanity. And it truly is him who is that man, that one person who stands between the living and the dead. And only those who submit to that high priest can be a part of the living. As I already said, we looked at this yesterday in Romans 3 in verses 25 through 26. You also see in Hebrews 2 and verse 17. Therefore he had to be made like his brethren in all things, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. He was that propitiation. He was the one that brought atonement. And he is the only one that could have brought the atonement. Now, not only that, but you also see, just like with Aaron, and just like as we see in Numbers chapter 16, but Jesus himself, while he is being persecuted, while he is on the cross, while he is being in the process of the crucifixion, what does he say as he prays to the Father? Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Now, again, all of these things I think are important to note. I think that they, again, encourage us. I think they bolster our faith. I think they help us see how this story, they help us see that scarlet thread woven all throughout God's masterpiece, as Jesus is the centerpiece of that story. Now, as we get into the conclusion here, why is it so important to see all of this? I just want to make a brief case for that. Why is it so important to see all of these things? Just a few things. One, this is a picture of respecting God's delegated authority. Respecting God's authority, first and foremost, but even as you go beyond that and extend past that, his delegated authority. Now, what do I mean by that? Has God not given certain roles to different individuals? You see in Hebrews chapter 13, if you're still in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 17, it says, obey your leaders and submit to them, for they keep watch over your souls as those who will give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with grief, for this would be unprofitable for you. I really do think that number 16, one thing that we should take from it, not the only thing, but one thing that we should take from this in terms of application is making sure that we don't follow after the example of the Israelites, that we don't follow after the example of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, as we're going to read in Jude 11 in just a moment. There are roles that God has given to us, and there are roles that God has put above us in terms of hierarchy or authority. And we are expected to respect that authority when it comes to the elders in the church. When it comes to other relationships, as you read in Colossians chapter 3, towards the end of that chapter, 18 through 22, there are lots of relationships that Paul goes through. Whether it be a child with his father and mother, whether it be a wife with her husband, or whether it be a slave with his master. God expects for us to respect those roles that we are in and not try to go beyond and take a role that is not appropriate for us to take or appropriate for us to try and fulfill. And so I think it is a picture of respecting God's authority. Beyond that, it's also a picture, as we started by talking about how they rejected God, it is a lesson in respecting God's method of worship. Whenever we try to make adjustments to the pattern, whenever we try to make adjustments to the instruction that God has given us, let me just suggest, it is never for God that we do that. It is never for him. We may say that, and we may use that as an excuse, but it is just an excuse. Whenever we try to add to or take away from the pattern, the good pattern that God has given us, it is specifically for ourselves. Or it is for someone else that we are trying to compromise for. And so we need to make sure that we don't follow after the pattern we find in number 16, that we don't try to change the pattern that God has given us and try to alter the instruction. We have just a major blessing in just being Christians. Remember what Peter says in 2 Peter chapter 2, that we are to be that royal priesthood, that holy nation. But guess what? We don't get to act like the high priest. Now, there's a great responsibility just in that. Don't take that for granted, as Korah, Dathan, and Abiram did. They had a beautiful relationship. They had a beautiful role that God had given them, and they took it for granted. They didn't take it seriously enough. And I think sometimes Christians can do that today. We don't take the relationship that God has given us seriously enough, and the responsibility of being that royal priesthood. And so we can depreciate that in our own minds. And so don't take being a Christian for granted. Going beyond that, I think it's important to look at what Jude says here as we conclude in here. In Jude, in verse 11, we read this on Sunday, but I'll just read it one more time. Jude is talking about those who have crept in unnoticed. And he's talking about false teachers. He's talking essentially about wolves in sheep's clothing, those who are sneaking into the church and causing and wreaking havoc. Those who are causing disruption in the brotherhood, and those that they need to be wary of. And how does he describe what kind of men these are? In verse 11, it says, "Woe to them, for they have gone the way of Cain, and for pay they have rushed headlong into the error of Balaam and perished in the rebellion of Korah." Now, when the New Testament uses the Old Testament for instruction, we have to know the context of that, and that's why we went through it tonight. And so, what are a few things that we need to take from that? It's important to know that Korah and his band, it's important to have this story familiar to us so that we can, first of all, spot those who are trying to sneak, as he says at the beginning of Jude, sneak in and creep in unnoticed. If they have characteristics like that of Korah and Balaam and Cain, we need to know what those characteristics are. We need to be able to spot the people, the false teachers. We need to be able to spot the wolves in sheep's clothing so that way they can't disrupt the congregation. I think there's a very strong point to be made in number 16 as you look at how closely associated the congregation was to Korah and his band. They had to separate themselves, and they had to make sure that they didn't touch anything, that they weren't stained with anything that was devoted to destruction. And I think you even see that towards the end of Jude, that we focus on trying to save our brethren and snatching them out of the fire, and on some have mercy with fear, hating even the garment polluted with the flesh. We need to be just as adamant when we separate from those who are just trying to walk in the way of Cain, Balaam, and ultimately those who will perish in rebellion. And I think that's one of the main points to make there as well. The notion of that the peril that these men will fall into. Know the end. Know the outcome. Not only is it important to know the characteristics of these men so that we can spot them, but know where they're headed. Because I don't want to go where they're going. In Hebrews 10, you might turn there. We'll look at that in just a moment. But in John 14 and verse 6, we know that verse very well. Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, the life." He is the only path to salvation. He is the only way to eternal life. And today, God only offers one high priest. He only offers one person that we can submit to, one king. And you don't get to choose a bunch of other routes. You don't get to go whatever way you want to go. Well, I mean, actually you can. You get to choose. But just understand that there's only one person that can lead you to salvation, and there's only one person that can stand in the breach of God's wrath for you. And if we forget that and we try to make someone else that person, they will fail. And they will fail so quickly and comically. And so we need to know, keep that in mind. In Hebrews 10, beginning in verse 11, Hebrews 10 and verse 11, it says, every priest stands daily ministering and offering time after time the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But he, having offered one sacrifice for sins for all time, sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time onward until his enemies be made a footstool for his feet. For by one offering he has perfected for all time those who are sanctified, and the Holy Spirit also testifies to us. For after saying, this is the covenant that I will make with them. After those days, says the Lord, I will put my laws upon their heart, and on their mind I will write them. He then says, and their sins and their lawless deeds I will remember no more. Now where there is forgiveness of these things, there is no longer any offering for sin. Again, just imagine yourself as a Hebrew, as a Jew, who had to focus so adamantly on each and every offering. You didn't get to say, you know what, I think I'm just going to focus on the burnt offering, and that's going to take care of everything else, like the grain offering, the peace offering, the guilt offering, and the sin offering. No, you didn't get to bundle them all up. Each one was important to God, and therefore each one was important to the individual. And can you imagine hearing the Hebrew writer now say to these people who have that in their minds, that context in their minds, Jesus fulfills it all. Well, what about, for atonement, but what about all these other things? He meets it all. He is the atonement offering. He is the offering that gives you a way to commune with the Lord. He is the offering which you are able to give tribute to come before the King, to come before a pure and holy God. He meets every requirement. And guess what? He's the only one. Where other priests would go and even the high priest, as it would mention throughout Hebrews, he has to go yearly on the Day of Atonement. But every single year there's a reminder. And what are they reminded of? Well, what they should have been reminded of is that God ultimately is pointing towards a sacrifice that will satisfy this someday. And when you get to Jesus, it should have been nothing but excitement. But as we already indicated, it was his own people who should have been excited that were the ones that put him on the cross. It should be no different today that we see this and we find nothing but excitement, nothing but true joy that he meets every single requirement we need, because it's a big debt that we've incurred in breaking God's law, in being the reason that Jesus, the Son of God, had to be put to death. And we should find the same amount of joy. And as I already said a moment ago, you can either accept him or you can reject. It's your choice. But understand, you don't get to determine the consequences. Incidentally, that's not your role. That's God's role. And no matter what you say, no matter how much you heal, God has the ultimate and final say. In Hebrews 10 again, finally in verse 26, skipping down just a few verses, it says, for if we go on sinning willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a terrifying expectation of judgment and the fury of a fire which will consume the adversaries. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much severer punishment do you think he will deserve who has trampled underfoot the Son of God and has regarded as unclean the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified and has insulted the Spirit of grace? For we know him who said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. And again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. You know how we talk about how many people today in the religious world will essentially say, well, the God of the Old Testament is nothing but wrathful, the God of the New Testament is nothing but graceful. I don't know. Do you read this verse? Do those same people read a verse like this? It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. It is, if all you have done is live your life in rebellion. If you want to reject, that is your choice. Understand, the ground won't open up, sure. But what is that judgment supposed to point to but ultimate judgment? The ground is not going to open up and swallow you, but you will go to hell. And that's a more terrifying picture. That's a more terrifying judgment. But that is the end that God is trying to establish, that every enemy of his will come to, all the way back in number 16. It's the exact same today. So, which end will you decide? You may be a Christian, and maybe there's another pattern that you have fallen to, other than God's, other than the instruction he's given you. And maybe you need to come back from that apostasy. Maybe you need to come back and make your life right with him. Please make sure that you're not walking in the same manner as as Korah, rather. Because remember the end. If you're not a Christian, our high priest has interceded for you, even while you were in rebellion, even while you're an active enemy, as it says in Romans chapter 5. Don't think that every day God blesses you with a new day of life. Every morning we get to wake up. Don't think that is a reward for good behavior necessarily. Maybe it is just a blessing of being his people, but it also very well could be that God is just being gracious and merciful with you. As with the Israelites, it may be just another chance that God, our gracious and long-suffering Father, is giving you before it is ultimately too late. So do not tempt the Lord any further. It is a terrifying thing, certainly, to fall into the hands of a living God as a rebel. But also understand it is an overwhelmingly joyous occasion to stand behind our beautiful high priest who stands in the breach of God's wrath, should you submit to him. Are you going to submit to him tonight? If you need help to do that tonight, if you want to become a part of his kingdom, be baptized into his death to rise in newness of life in his life, we can help you with that. If you're subject to the invitation of Christ by any means, please come forward as we stand.